We've got Dr. Neal Thigpen, the godfather of PD politics, with us today. We also have a friend of mine, Branham, is sitting in to play the, what can I say, the semi-liberal foil portion of this show. Brant and I have a history together. Brant was actually my chief of staff when I was lieutenant governor. And if you want to know about the partisanship in politics, when I hired Brant to be my chief of staff, one of these bloggers ran a blog, said he's the son of a Democrat House member. The rhino from Florence has misled the Republican voters of the state, and it didn't take us long to find out. And I said, no, the guy doesn't see the world exactly the way I do. And the last thing I wanted was a yes man. The last thing I wanted was somebody to tell me, yeah, man, everything you say is exactly right. I think that's a lot of the problem in American politics today. But Brant's he's kind of a political junkie, I guess, to some degree, really enjoys the art and science of politics. And we'll have a lot of fun today, kind of not revisiting what we did. We don't want to go there, but we'll obviously talk about politics of today and moving forward. Doc, I'll start with you. I would not have ever thought nor considered of messing with tenure if you were still a tenured professor. So I want you to understand, for clarity's sake, that you would have been, and if I had been involved, and if you were, you would have been excluded from any doing away with tenure.
Let me tell you how little I knew about the academic world. I wasn't real sure about that stuff when I was in graduate. A lot of times when you're in graduate school, they don't tell you all this kind of stuff if you want to be a professor when you get out. Never told me how little political scientists could make, as compared to guys in commerce and the sciences and mathematics and these other disciplines in one thing or another. But, tenure is one of those kind of things. It can protect the faculty member. I mean, if you had a situation like, I'll tell you, we wind up getting this real liberal president, Lee Vickers, out at Francis Marion. He thought anybody who lived in the South and you were white and you were on a faculty like ours, and most of it, when he came, I've been in there 30 years and more and whatever, that we were all a bunch of racists. Now, if you didn't have tenure, which wasn't true, we've Francis Marion's always kind of been a moderate in the middle. Dr. Smith was very careful. He didn't want anybody who was going to cause any damn trouble, who was a lefty or someplace. Or, matter of fact, when I was recruiting for political science positions, the dean told me, Jack Baker in those days, we don't want anybody from north of the Mason-Dixon line nor west of the Mississippi. He said, you don't have to be a Dixiecrat or a conservative or something, but we don't want anybody who could cause difficulties. Try to keep it in the middle. And that's what I did. Anyway, tenure has its own benefits and rewards. If Lee Vickers had come in and there had been no tenure system at Francis Marion, he was a lefty's lefty, he would have fired all of us. And we wouldn't have had any recourse, even though we had worked there and, and been diligent and helped build the various disciplines and build up the enrollment and recruit good faculty members. He would have just come in and bingo. Now, as it turned out, he did remove a lot of us who he thought were reasonably conservative as department chairman. He kicked me out. He said, we don't want any, Republican types, who are probably racist and all this kind of thing, and kicked my tail right out, after 24 years of running that department. Although I was there, I did it too long. It was time for some young person to get it. But if you didn't have tenure, and the trick to it is, like Dr. Smith, Doug Smith, who was our first president, he said, when they come in, and they ain't no good, and they're not cooperative, or they're no damn good in the classroom, or they're bad on their administrative paperwork, which you got to do, get rid of them before that 6th year. Get in there and get them gone.
That's interesting. I want to jump to Brant here for a second. Brant's a little bit like I am. He reads a lot, tries to better understand the issue challenging and dealing with the country. I actually sent Brant the Peter Thiel piece because he and I have had some discussions about student debt. Obviously, Dr. Thigpen had a very unique interest in tenured professorships. But, Brant, I think mine and your conversations have been more about the financial side of it, the amount of student debt there is and the amount in delinquent deferment or default.
We did. We talked a lot, and I appreciate y'all having me here. It's good to see everybody again. It's been a while since I've been around. But we have it, and it is a bubble, and it's being it reminds me so much, and you and I talked earlier, and you mentioned I was listening, driving in, of the housing bubble, and that's what it reminds me of. As I say, the broke lobby, they ain't got a lot of Yank in Washington. So the students are the pawns now, and the borrowers were the pawns earlier. And it's the same thing. The financial industry played those people more than those people played the financial industry. And I think students now are being used as pawns, and a tremendous amount obviously in the for-profit universities. Mm-hmm. And what's going on there?
It's rampant there.
It's rampant there with, 98%, up to some people say up to 98% of the fraud cases on student loans are in for-profit universities. And I say that not to say there's not a place for for-profit universities. That's the private sector getting into education. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's far more of the fraud of people taking advantage of students in that industry than there are at the public or non-profit private university.
Like Donald Trump with Trump University.
Mm-hmm. It was a fraud. I mean, it was a sham.
Complete fraud.
It was a fraud and a sham.
He's been sued a bunch of times, and he had to pay. Private universities or private colleges and stuff, these for-profit institutions, a lot of them are fifth rate. I mean, I don't want to say all of them. They pay their faculty members double what somebody working for a public institution can make, and they don't give them anything, and they prey on these folks who haven't got their family, they don't have much educational background. In a lot of cases, I don't want to say low IQ, but they're people who just, they haven't had a chance, and all of a sudden somebody gets in and sells them this bill of goods, and they promise them that when they get through, low dog, college, that we'll get you a job. And see, we can, in academics, we could never kind of do that.
I got you. I want to go back to Brant real quick, and I want to get your take on this. Brant spends a lot of time in Columbia at the State House, kind of working behind the scenes. But Brant, there's always been a fundamental question about is government responsible for funding higher education? I mean, we've chosen as a country that we believe to some degree it is the responsibility, but there has been a decline in funding from our state government and states all over the country in relation to public higher education.
I think that is a fundamental question. I have that conversation with many folks that follow it. Is there a role in government funding of higher education? I happen to think that there is. I don't, again, have as to what level and where it should where that should fall. I'm like anyone else. I think an educated electorate, populace, workforce is important. Does it have to come through higher education? No. But we got to believing that, and I believe that education is important. But that's a fundamental question we're going to have to ask ourselves going forward, because there is a bubble being created that is not sustainable. And how that's going to be handled going forward is going to be a tough question.
And if the bubble is there, and I think the bubble is, we'll shift gears to get to the midterms here. If the bubble is there, and you're someone who runs for public office seeking re-election, the last thing you want to do is be guilty of putting more public money exposed to part of that bubble, because there's a reality there, and I understand the reality, and you understand the reality, but there's a public perception of this bubble is there. You legislator, and you're still putting more money in higher education, and I think that's the perception dilemma.
I agree, and not to get belabor this, because I know you want to talk about midterms, as do I. But I pose this only as a thought. So many things that end up being flawed in government are unintended consequences of good programs. Mm-hmm. And I throw this only out as I was thinking about, and I do not think that this is a bad program. I think it's an excellent program. But is the amount of student debt and where it's grown, was the impetus behind that the GI Bill? We got everybody home from World War II, and the government decided they were going to provide funding for veterans to go to higher education. I still think that's a good idea for them to do that. But was that the first step into the student loan business, even though the GI Bill was not a loan, as I understand it? I don't know the nuances of the program.
Correct.
But was that the step that made everybody think, we got all these boys home from the war,
We owe them something.
let's send them to college.
Mm-hmm. And let's pay
And
for
so
it.
then that blew up into where we are today. Unintended consequence of a good program.
Well, I think that happens very often in government, whether it's state, local, or federal government. You'll have something done in a very good and genuine spirit, and it ends up becoming something it was never intended to be. And I think both parties have a long-standing history of being a part of that.
But we don't adjust the program
and why
try
is that,
to
Doc?
save it.
And then that's where I was headed.
You know, what we do, I've told you, about when I was in graduate school, I was in one of these seminars, and the guy who was the professor was reasonably conservative. He was hesitant about government and spending and all that kind of thing. He was kind of he was a public administration guy, more so than a straight-out political scientist. And, he brought the picture of the Etzel in, the old Ford automobile. It lasted about 1 year. And all we said, if this were a government agency, we'd still have it.
Still be building it.
It's still, even though it was flunked as a, in the marketplace. But let me tell you, the business guys have tried to get a grip on these universities. Some of these national bodies on higher education, they're not backed up by academic people. In a lot of cases, they'll hire a few academics who are real conservative and management people and try to get their ideas. Getting rid of tenure is one of them. Let's run these places like businesses. And the institutions themselves, they want business. They got to, this is the notion, we go to school the rest of our lives, reaccreditation, seminars and continuing education and all this nonsense, but what that's to keep the doors open, keep paying the professors.
Keep the money churning.
Dr. Thigpen makes a good point, and as he continually does. But, for-profit universities are run by business people. Mm-hmm. So there's got to be a mix somewhere. I mean, we turn it over to the business people, and that's for-profit universities.
Well, you and I were
capitalism.
talking about that yesterday. Brant's got to challenge me on that. I'm challenging back. I said, no, that's the government's backstopping the loans, and if you allow the government to backstop the loan, the business people are going to do. There's always been a yin and a yang with the business guy and the academic. I mean, you and I. We've always been healthy suspicious.
You and I have exchanged it on here lots of times.
Sure we have.
The business guys are contemptuous of academics. They don't know how to run anything. They don't know how to do anything. They've never balanced a budget. They've never met a payroll and all this kind of stuff. But the old expression is, anti-intellectualism is the anti-Semitism of the businessman. They don't want any, left-wingy, professors running around.
I can remember early in our time in Columbia, Brant comes to me one day and says, hey, you got to go across the street with me. I said, for what? He said, these people at the Office on Aging, they know you come with the private sector, know you're a business guy. All of them are fearful for their job. They're afraid you go come over here and fire everybody and try to run things with 10% of the employees. There's always been that. I mean, at times it's an unhealthy suspicion that the private sector or the business guy has with the bureaucrat of the public sector and vice versa. It's almost like there's got to be some common ground there. That there needs to be an understanding that bureaucracies can't be run like the private sector. They're not intended to be run like the private sector, but there needs to be some sort of business principles that apply.
No, I agree. And when you start painting with broad brushes and talking about, in this case, business people and academics and what's better to have, and I think there's a mix. I mean, it reminds me of somebody saying, I'm not a vegetarian because I am a vegetarian because I didn't eat my dog. I mean, come on, so
why didn't you eat your dog?
It's not that way. I mean, you're not in and out. There's a mix there. It doesn't have to be to that extreme. And the mix in private and public sector and academics is going to have to exist for it to be successful, in my opinion.